In this video, I'm going to show you how you can set up a simple squash and stretch rig using Blender's Lattice and Bendy Bones. And it's a fantastic way to make your characters feel more squishy, dynamic, and alive. You can add anticipation, subtle secondary motion, and you can even use it to stylize some movements. Heck, sometimes you can get away by just using this simple setup. Not that I did that or anything. This works by combining two powerful yet simple Blender features. A lattice, which acts as a transform cage, allowing for smooth deformations, and bendy bones, or B-bones, which replace long chains of small rigid bones, making it easy to create organic, flexible motion with just a single bone. They also behave like a curve, which is super powerful. I also show you a way how you can integrate this thing with a pre-existing rig that you might have. And if you're short on time, I even made an add-on that automates most of this process. You can grab it from my Ko-fi page, the link is in the description. And if you want to know how to use it, just jump to this timestamp. So if you're ready to learn something about lattices and rigging, buckle up, let's jump right in and set up the lattice. Press Shift A and select Lattice. Next, scale it in object mode so it fully encompasses the character. A trick I use is moving the lattice up and then setting the 3D cursor as the transform pivot point. This lets us scale from the bottom of the character, which is a bit easier. In the lattice data properties, increase the resolution and change the interpolation type from B-spline to linear. Now select any object in your scene, go to the modifier tab and add a lattice modifier. And use the eyedropper tool to select the lattice. To apply this modifier to all objects of your character, select everything except the lattice. Then shift-click the object with the lattice modifier last. Click this small arrow in the modifier stack and choose Copy to Selected. If you move the lattice in object mode, nothing really happens. But if you switch to edit mode on the other hand and move the points, you'll see that the lattice acts like a transform cage. This is a great way to quickly experiment with proportions in modeling, and I use it all the time. Now that the lattice is ready, let's build a rig to control it. Select the lattice and go into edit mode. Select the middle point and press Shift S. Then choose Cursor to select it. Now press Shift A, go to Armature and select Single Bone. Rename the armature by selecting it in object mode and press F2. I'll call it Squash and Stretch Rig. To make the bones more visible through our character, go to the armature properties and enable Show in Front. And also check Show Names. If the bone names don't show up, go to Viewport Overlays and enable the text info. I'll rename the first bone to Squash and Stretch Main, since it will drive the lattice later on. In the bone properties, change the display type from octahedral to B-bone. To get the lattice's full height and to match the bone to it, go into edit mode and select this middle point here and snap the 3D cursor to it with Shift S, cursor to selected. Then select the top of the SQST main bone, press Shift S and choose Selection to Cursor. Next we'll need some control bones. So I extrude a bone from the Squash and Stretch main bone with E and I rename it to Bendy Bone Squash and Stretch Top. Then I duplicate the bone with Shift D and move it straight down along the Z-axis. To be precise, I'll snap the bone with the 3D cursor to the main bone. Parent the Squash and Stretch main bone to this bone with Ctrl P and select Connected. Then I duplicate the Bendy Bone Squash and Stretch top bone with Shift D and right click to cancel the movement. This creates an exact copy in place. In the Bendy Bone properties, I slightly increase the display size so we can distinguish them a bit better. I rename the top bone to only Squash and Stretch Top and the bottom one to Squash and Stretch Bottom. I unparent the Squash and Stretch Top by pressing Alt P. Next we'll need to add two bone constraints. Select the Bendy Bone Squash and Stretch Top bone in Pose mode and in the Bone Constraints tab add a Copy Transforms constraint. Select the Squash and Stretch Top bone as its target. Now there's a faster way of adding constraints. For this, in this case, select both bones and make sure you select the bone you want to add the constraint to last. Then press Shift Ctrl C and select Copy Transforms. The second constraint I like to add is a Stretch to constraint. Select the Squash and Stretch top bone, the big one, and then the Squash and Stretch main bone last, and press Shift Ctrl C and select the Stretch to constraint. Now we have a really cool squash and stretch behavior that even keeps the volume the same when the bone is squashing or stretching. I want to utilize the powerful features of Blender's Bendy Bones. So I select the lattice and increase its resolution to something like 12. Then I select the main bone, and under the bone properties, I increase the bendy bone segments. However, if we set it to 12, the lattice and the bone segments won't match perfectly. To fix this, set the number of bendy bone segments to one less than the lattice resolution. In that case, 11. Now our bendy bones are not only squashing and stretching, but also behave like a curve now, which is super powerful. As a last step, we need to tell the rig somehow that it should drive the lattice. For this, select the lattice and add an armature modifier. Select the rig as its target. Then in the data properties of the lattice, we need to add a new vertex group and name it the exact same way we named the main bone in the beginning. In my case, it's sqst_main. Then hop into edit mode, select all the points with A, and then assign a weight of 1 to all of them. If everything turns red, you're good. Now with this setup, you can not only move the control bones and get already a lot of movement out of them, but because we used bendy bones, you can also twist and rotate them to get even more out of this setup. To finish things off, I clean things up a bit and move the bones I don't want to animate to their separate collection. In the armature properties, under bone collection, rename this collection to control, and then create a new one and call it MCH. Then hop into edit mode and select the main bone and assign it to the MCH collection and remove it from the control collection. Then hide the MCH collection. In the outliner, I usually hide the lattice object and make it unselectable. And with that, we're done. At the start of the video, I promised to show you a quicker way of doing this. To save some time for scenes where I need to set up this rig over and over again, I created a small add-on that automates the process. With the Squash and Stretch add-on installed and enabled, you can simply box select all your objects, press Shift A, and under Armature, select Create Squash and Stretch Rig. And just like that, you have the same setup in a fraction of the time. If you find value in that, you can download the add-on from my Ko-fi page. The link is in the description. Now let's say you already have a rigged character and you want to combine it with the Squash and Stretch rig. If that's the case, it would be wise to combine these two rigs together, because otherwise you would need to animate two rigs all at once and jump from object mode to pose mode again and again, and that would be super painful to animate. Now here's the plan for what we're going to do. We're going to create two control bones in the existing rig that are going to drive the two bones from the lattice via copy transform constraints. Then we're going to parent the lattice object and the armature object to the hip bone of the character, so they're following the character in object mode. This way we can prevent weird double transforms that usually occur when working with lattices. First go into edit mode in our lattice armature and duplicate the top and bottom bone. Then press P to separate them into a new armature. Select the new armature and the character armature last and press Ctrl J to combine them. Then hide the lattice and the armature and rename the newly created bones. Now the next step is totally optional, but I want to have some user-friendly control shapes, like in the rig here. Create a collection and call it widgets. Then create any object for a control shape. I use the good old default cube for that and rename it to widget squash and stretch. Then I merge the bottom points together and delete the faces to get a wireframe pyramid shape. Then hide the collection and hop into pose mode of the character rig. In the bow properties, select the custom shape and tweak the values until it's at the right location. In edit mode, under bone properties viewport display, I also give them a custom color. Then in the lattice armature, I add a copy transforms constraint targeting the character rig. Now, if things break here, don't panic, just select the right bone as well. Do the same thing for the bottom bone. Now we need to do some parenting, because currently the lattice rig and the lattice aren't following our character rig. To fix this, locate the main mover controller of your character. Now this differs from rig to rig. In bipedal rigs, this is usually the center of gravity bone or the hip controller. In object mode, select the armature and the lattice with shift and then the character rig last. Go into pose mode and select the hip controller. Press Ctrl P and select bone. put the lattice object and the lattice rig in the character collection, hide them and make them not selectable. As a last step, select the character rig and hop into edit mode and parent the top and bottom bone to the hip bone. With that, we successfully added the lattice rig to our existing rig, giving us the best of both worlds. And that wraps up this rigging tutorial. A huge shout out to my Ko-fi supporters. Your support helps me making these tutorials and I truly appreciate it. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if there's anything specific that you want to see me covered in a future video. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.